If you've ever sprinkled salt on your watercolor paintings to create some cool texture and then thought, wait, why isn't it doing anything? Then you are in the right place. Watercolor salt texture looks magical when it works, but many tutorials skip over the tiny details that make or break the effect. So today we are testing everything: timing, paper wetness, paper types and brands, even different types of salt, and all the mistakes that secretly ruin the texture so you can finally get results that actually look beautiful. So what are we waiting for? Let's get started. So I'm just going to go ahead and pull out some watercolor supplies here. The paint brand in my palette is M. Graham & Company paint. I'm not going to be using different paint types today because this is basically going to be my control group for all of our experiments. I also have some clean water, a paper towel, and then of course we need a brush. I think I'm going to pull out a number 10 round today. This is a larger size. We're going to be practicing a lot of washes of color to test out our salt texture theories on, so this way we can cover a large space in a short amount of time. And as a side note, if you're interested in my Craftamo brush set or my Craftamo subscription boxes, they are both back in stock. I will leave a link for these as well as any of the other products you see me using today in the description of this video. So like I say, we are going to be trying a ton of stuff to see what works and what doesn't work. Now, of course, I am not going to be able to try absolutely every combination that exists, but we are going to do the best that we can so we can at least answer some of the major questions. So here I have a piece of watercolor paper that I know I can get salt texture to work on. Again, this is going to be part of our control group at this moment, but in a minute we will go over different paper types as well. I'm just going to tape this off into 4 different sections so we can try 4 different things. Let's start out first with the wetness of the paper. This is probably one of the major points to making salt texture work. So we're going to try 4 different water wetnesses here. That kind of sounds weird. I'm probably not saying that right, but you get what I mean. And then let's see which way works best. For my sample test, I'm just going to pull out some Hooker's green paint here to use on all 4 of these samples. Again, I'm going to try to keep as many things the same as I can, except for how much water I'm using so that we can really tell the difference. So for our first sample, let's try a really dry test sheet first with not very much water and not very much paint. I'm trying to put this paint right on here without any water layer first. It's almost like dry brushing it on. And this actually might still be a little bit too wet for what I'm trying to show, so I'm going to dry this off just a little bit more. The idea with this is that when you're doing a larger painting and filling in bigger spaces, sometimes your paint can start to dry out as you're working, and then by the time you get to adding in that salt, the paint that you initially put on there is already dried out too much. I think that's good enough. So let me pull out the salt really quickly. Again, I'm going to be using this exact same salt on all 4 of these samples right now just to keep some amount of control in our tests. The paper right now is still slightly damp to the touch, but if I were to pick up the paper and tip it back and forth, no water or paint at all would be running from side to side. It's only just barely damp. Now, something about salt texture, it does take a minute for everything to start activating and work, and you definitely do not want to speed up the drying process. No hair dryers at all when you're trying to do salt texture. This is just going to take some patience. So as we wait to see what happens with our dry sample, let's go ahead and do completely opposite of that next and have a way too wet sample. So this time I'm taking a lot of water and putting that in the space first. It's really wet, almost to the point where it's pooling and dripping even. Now I will also put in some Hooker's green paint that's also fairly watered down, and I'm going to go ahead and add that into our sample. Again, it's just really nice and wet. If I were to pick up the paper and tip it back and forth, it would definitely run from side to side because that's how much water is on here. I'll go ahead now and take some salt and sprinkle that on here. I might do half of this section with a less amount of salt and then the other half with a heavier amount of salt just to see how that affects the sample as well. You can see right off the bat that the water is really sucking right up into that salt. In the corners, there's water and paint starting to pool because there's so much on here. I might even take just a little bit of that off with my paper towel just because there is so much. All right, moving on to our third sample. This time, let's paint on water and paint without a water layer first, but it's going to be a little bit more watered down. It's not going to be super dry, but at the same time, it's also not going to be so wet that it's pooling. Just a nice wash of color. All right, then after I have the paint on here, I am going to immediately put the salt on top before it has a chance to start drying. I'll again have one side with a little bit lighter on the salt and the other side a little bit heavier so that we can see the difference there as well. What's interesting here is that I can already see the texture starting to work. The paint and water is sucking up into the salt already, but it's definitely not creating the puddles like the last one. Okay, we'll let that sit for a minute and let it do its thing. For our last test, let's try a water layer again first, but this time I'm definitely not going to put as much. I'm going to keep the water layer a little bit more mellow, just barely enough to cover the space and help the paint spread around. Then I'll go ahead and add in the paint to fill in the area. So this is going to be a little bit more on the wet side compared to the one that we just did, but definitely not so wet that it's creating those pools and puddles on the page. And take a look at the last sample. It's already starting to create some awesome texture. The other two are pretty much doing nothing still. The first one is just too dry. I don't think it's even going to create a texture at all, but we'll wait and see. The second one is still so wet. If it does create texture, it's going to be a while for us to find that out. This one that we just did is starting to react already, so I'm just going to turn the camera off for a few minutes, and we'll come back in maybe 5 or 10 minutes and see the progress. Okay, here I am about 5 minutes later. Let's look at the progress we have going on. Our first one that is too dry of a sample still has pretty much done nothing. The too wet sample seems to be making a little bit of texture, but it's still pretty sopping wet. In fact, I feel like instead of making the really neat designs, that salt is kind of just dissolving into the water. The third sample actually worked out really well. It's pretty much dry now. There wasn't a ton of water on there, but it's obviously wet enough that it did create the nice texture that we're looking for. And this fourth one that had slightly more water on it than the third sample is still not quite done reacting yet. I've sprinkled about the same amount of salt on these last two, but because the fourth one did have a little bit more water on there, I think it is going to create a larger texture. Here's just my thought with these two. They're obviously the best two to work with, somewhere in between the too dry and the too wet. I feel like for the smaller area, being able to just put that paint straight on there worked really well. It's creating the nice separated texture marks, but when you're painting a larger piece, then you do have that risk of the paint drying out a little bit too quickly. So for example, I did this piece a while back, and I did put a water layer on here first before I added in the paint because it's such a larger area to cover, and I really didn't want anything to start drying out before I had the salt on. So I feel like if you're doing a larger piece, having the light water layer before you add the paint would really help keep it wet a little bit longer. But if you're doing a smaller painting, like maybe a card or a bookmark or something, then you could totally just put that paint layer straight on there and still get some awesome texture. So some of these are still a little bit damp. I'm just going to peel this off and set it off to the side to let it finish drying, and then we can move on to our next set of tests. So next up, let's try and see what happens if we do this texture on different types of paper. I have everything here from amateur all the way up to high grade professional. First, I have Hippie Crafter, which is basically, in my opinion, great for kids. I do not enjoy painting on this paper at all. I don't have much success with it, but it's going to be great for our test today. I also have some Canson paper, which is a paper type that I used to use a lot when I couldn't afford a higher quality paper. It's not 100% cotton, but I was still able to make some pretty paintings with it. Next up, we have Meeden watercolor paper that is 100% cotton. This is one of my favorite, most affordable brands of paper. And then lastly, I have some Arches paper, which is the paper that I paint on for just about everything. I absolutely love this paper. I definitely recommend this brand. In fact, I've become a little bit of a paper snob after I've started using this. I just could not go back to the Canson paper after I actually tried some good paper. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and take a sheet of each of these papers, cut out a little square sample test paper from each one, as well as label on the back what paper I'm using so I don't get mixed up. We're going to start with the cheap paper and work our way up to the most expensive, more professional paper and just see what happens, or if it even makes a difference. And like I say, there are way more different types of paper and brands out there. It's just impossible for me to test them all, but hopefully this is going to give us a good idea of what can happen if you use different paper types. Now, because we've already tested out the water amount that seems to work best with this texture, I'm going to go ahead and use the best method that I think works for this size of paper. So I'm going to use some nice watered down paint and just put that directly onto the small sample papers. Like I say, if it were larger, I would probably do a water layer first, but this seemed to work pretty good for these smaller sizes. All right, now after I have this nice and wet, I'm going to immediately take the salt and start sprinkling that on there before it can start to dry. I'll try to use maybe about the same amount of salt that I was doing on our last water tests, with a lighter amount of salt off to the left side and a heavier amount off to the right side. And just so you know, this is still the same salt that I was using on the last test again. We do have to keep some sort of control within these samples to test them. So right now I've got the same paint brand, the same water amount, and the same type of salt, just on different paper. Now, like I say, it might take a minute for this to react, but right off the bat, I'm really not seeing too much going on. In fact, I thought maybe my paper was too dry at first, but I did touch it and it is still wet. So maybe it's just going to take a few more minutes to do its thing. I'm going to go ahead and peel this off of my table and just set it off to the side here while we work. Then we can do the next one and still leave this in the camera shot. That way we can still watch as it reacts and we continue to work. So on to the next paper. Let's try out the Canson paper. Again, just cut a square out from here. I'm writing on the back. I'm going to apply the same amount of water and paint, and then immediately afterwards sprinkle on that same type of salt. Now, just so you kind of get the idea of how the salt is creating the texture, basically what's happening is the salt naturally attracts and absorbs the water molecules and its surroundings. So when you sprinkle the salt onto a wet wash of watercolor paint, each salt crystal draws the pigment or tinted water towards itself. As the salt absorbs the liquid, it pulls the paint and pigment along with it, concentrating the color directly beneath the crystal, which is why sometimes you'll see, and I'll show you in just a minute, after we take off the salt, there's often a dark spot left where the salt was sitting. And at the same time, it also leaves a lighter, desaturated starburst or bloom pattern around the salt. In other words, it's kind of like a little sponge that the paint and water is getting sucked up into, stripping or exposing the white paper or lighter undertones underneath. All right. I'm not sure that that is doing much either, but again, we might need to just give it a minute and see what happens. So let's go ahead and move on to our third paper type, which is the Meeden brand. I really like painting on this brand of paper, so I'm excited to see how this one reacts. And while I get this ready to test out, don't forget to like and subscribe, especially if you're finding this video helpful. I really hope that we're going to answer some of your salt texture questions today. So if you find you are enjoying my painting and teaching style, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on any of my upcoming weekly tutorials. All right, I've got my wet paint layer on here now. I'm just going to go ahead and sprinkle on the salt, and I can already see that this is starting to suck up that water and paint a little bit better than the other two paper types. Just as a little side note, I am noticing that my first two paper types still are not reacting very much. I can say I actually tested out both of these papers previously, and just so you know, they're actually reacting the same way as earlier. At first I thought maybe I wasn't doing it right, but this is my second time around with these paper types with the same water and the same salt, and it still isn't doing much. So I don't think it was just a one-time fluke. It kind of seems like this is how these papers just react. All right, my last test paper sample is the Arches watercolor paper, and I'm noticing that the last sample that we did, the medium paper, is reacting just a little bit, so we'll keep letting that sit and see what happens. I'll go ahead and spread some color on here, and then we'll sprinkle some salt and see what we can do. Again, I'm trying really hard to keep approximately the same amount of water and using the same amount of salt on each of these tests to try to make it as fair as possible. Okay, it is a bit early, but I can already see a little bit of reaction going on. So we're going to let this sit a few more minutes and we'll come back to it. All right, I'm back again. It's only been maybe 2 minutes and I can already see some awesome blooms on this Arches paper. Moving on to the Meaden paper, it does have a bit of reaction. It's not quite as crisp as the Arches paper, and the first two, Hippie Crafter and Canson, still seems like they're not doing much. So I'm going to pull these off and just set them off to the side. That way we can do one more sample test, and that is going to be trying out different kinds of salts. And I will tell you, out of all three of the tests that we're doing today, the salt test was actually the most surprising of all three that I did, and you'll see why in just a minute. So here I am with some Arches paper because it seems like that was working the best. I'm going to go ahead and tape off the 4 squares or sections, and that way we can try out 4 different salts. So let's start off first with the salt that we've already been using on our other samples. I picked the salt to use on our other tests because it's one I've used before and I know works well. This is Baja Mineral Sea Salt. It is a fine ground salt, but something that I really like about it is that it seems to have different textures in it. So sometimes I'll have pieces that are a little bit smaller or some that are a little bit larger. And in fact, sometimes it even clumps or sticks together, which also creates a variety of sizes of the blooms that it makes. I've had a lot of success with it whenever I've tried it out. Next up, I have a salt that I just found at my local grocery store. This is Mediterranean salt. It's in a grinder here because it does have larger crystals. So I'm going to grind some of these up to be a little bit smaller and we'll see what happens there. Then I have some Himalayan pink salt crystals. This is a salt type I see all the time around where I live, so I'm really curious to see how this one reacts. It's also in a grinder. And for the last salt that I'm going to be testing out, it's actually just some ordinary iodized table salt that I have in my house and use for cooking all the time. So we'll see what happens with that. My prediction is that this one is not going to work as well, but we're about to find out. All right, I'm going to go ahead and spread on some wet paint here, and maybe I will try the table salt first. Like I say, I feel like this one's probably not going to work as well as the others. I'm also going to sprinkle a lesser amount on the left side and a little bit more on the right side, just like we've been doing in the last tests. There's no way I can test out every salt out there, so I just grabbed some that I could either find at my local grocery store or that I already had on hand. So depending on the salt or paper or even the paint you have, you may come up with different results than I am today. The bottom line is that all of these things have an effect or a factor into making the salt texture work, so just keep that in mind. All right, we'll let that table salt just sit there a little bit, but while we wait, let's go ahead and move on to our second type. I think I'm going to try out this Himalayan salt. Now, I don't want to use the really large crystals yet, so I'm going to grind these ones up into the lid, and then I can sprinkle that onto my sample page. This is pretty finely ground, so I'm not sure how big our blooms are going to be with this. I'm going to go ahead and spread on some of the paint here, and then once again, immediately start sprinkling that Himalayan salt onto the page, a little bit less on the left side and more on the right side, just to stay consistent with what I've been doing. It does seem like right off the bat, the water and paint is starting to get sucked up into that. Before we move on to our third sample, check out our table salt. I'm actually super surprised by this. They're small, but they are actually creating watercolor blooms in there. I'm kind of actually impressed and surprised by this. I really didn't think it would do this well. Okay, next up, let's go ahead and try the Mediterranean sea salt. Now, this is also a grinder, and I don't want to have all of my salt ground up quite as small as the Himalayan salt. So this time I decided to pick through there and find some salt crystals that were more on the medium size to see if that made a difference. So after I have my paper completely covered and nice and wet, I'll immediately start placing my crystals on there. And since some of these are a little bit larger in size, I'll be slightly more strategic about how I'm placing them on, but I will also sprinkle a few smaller salt crystals in the mix as well. You can see that my last Himalayan pink salt is starting to react now, so we'll give that a few more minutes. But you know what, as I was thinking about this, using these larger salt crystals might actually require a little bit more of a wet layer. So I'm going to try this one more time with the Mediterranean sea salt crystals, and this time I'm going to section off a small space here and add a water layer first so that it's a little bit more wet, and then add the paint on top of that. Now that this is nice and wet, I'm going to go ahead and take a few larger crystals and place them in the space, and we'll see what happens. I'm curious to see if it makes a difference with how much water you need compared to how large the salt crystals are. Okay, those are all going to take just a minute to start reacting. All three of my other samples are really doing well so far. In fact, I know it's a little bit early, but they all look fairly similar. They're all creating some nice blooms. Most of them are a little bit smaller in size, but they're all reacting pretty well so far. So let's go ahead and use this last little section of paper to sample that Baja Mineral Sea Salt. Now, like I said, this is the salt I've been using throughout the other tests because I know it works well, but we're going to add some on here too, just so we can have it to compare against the other salts. With this salt sample, I'm also just going to put a lesser amount of salt on the page too and see if that changes how it looks. And like I say, this was actually the most surprising to me of all of the tests that I've done, even though it's still a little bit early and everything's not done drying yet. I thought that using different salt types would actually be the biggest difference or effect on how this texture would work or not work. And I was very wrong in that train of thought. As you can see, all of the salt so far is creating pretty much the same type of texture. They've all worked really well. The biggest difference that I've seen today was how wet the paper should be and with what paper type we used. Well, it's been fun to experiment. It's starting to get dark right now and my kids are home for the summer. So I'm gonna go spend some time with them and I'm gonna let these dry overnight and then we'll come back tomorrow and take all that salt off and then do some more comparison. So see you in a minute. Well, here I am again. It's a new day. Let's go check our salt textures and see how they turned out. So first up here on my table is still our salt samples. A lot of them look pretty similar to how I left them yesterday, with a big difference being the larger crystals that we tried at the end. Now I'm just going to rub off all of the salt with my fingers really quick. We'll dump that off and then we can observe this a little bit better. Okay, now that the salt is off of there, I'm going to rip off the tape and let's see what we have. And right off the bat, I'm noticing that the table salt didn't leave quite as many of those really dark spots that sit underneath the salt, but it still reacted pretty much the same way as the Himalayan salt and the Mediterranean salt. I think the biggest difference is that with the Mediterranean salt, I tried a few larger crystals rather than having them all small ground. I'm also noticing that the sides where I put more salt almost detracts from the cool individual texture that the salt can create compared to where they're a little bit more spread apart. So either way works, just depending on the look that you're going for, I guess. I think the biggest difference that I saw from when I left to when I've come back are the really large salt crystals that I put on here with the extra water, and having the extra water really allowed that to suck into those larger crystals and create some really big, awesome blooms. If you like the smaller texture, then the smaller or ground salt crystals work great. My overall final opinion of this is that I was surprised, even though I used all different salt types, even the table salt, they all reacted and looked pretty similar. So I think of all of the variances that we're trying out, the type of salt you use is probably going to have the least effect on whether the texture works or not. Okay, moving on, I'm going to pull out our first page that we practiced the amounts of water with. I'm going to go ahead and rub off all the salt, and right off the bat, I'm noticing that the first square, that salt pretty much did not stick at all or do anything. With the second square, because it was so wet, the crystals pretty much dissolved on here, and I'm really having a harder time rubbing that salt off. Okay, so as we can tell, if your paper is too dry, like I said, this was damp when I put them on here, but there just wasn't enough moisture to actually suck up into the crystals. So if your paper's too dry, you are not going to get much of a reaction at all. If it's too wet, well, we obviously did get some texture, but it's not the really cool blooms that we're hoping for. The last two samples were obviously our best options, where the paper is nice and wet, either using a nice wet watered down paint concentrate or by wetting down the paper first and then adding in the paint on top of that. I think either of those ways seem to work pretty good. It's just important to keep in mind that if there's a little bit more water, then that's going to allow that salt to suck up more, so you're probably going to end up with larger blooms. And once again, it's also important to note that depending on the size of your painting, it might change how much water you use initially. If it's larger, you need to keep that paper from drying out too quickly, but on the opposite end, if it's smaller, you probably don't need as much. So this is kind of the tricky balance and probably the hardest variable to make work with this texture. All right, and last up is our 4 different paper types, and like I say, I tried really hard to keep the colors about the same value, put about the same amount of water, use the same type of salt on all of these paper types, and we had a pretty big difference. So let me rub off some of the salt and we'll show you what we have going on here. Now, our Hippie Crafter paper really didn't give us much, and neither did the Canson paper. They left a little bit of dark patches underneath where the salt was, but we really didn't get much of a bloom from either one of those at all. Here's the Meaden paper, and it definitely worked better than both the Hippie Crafter and the Canson. You can see the difference here. It did start to bloom out just a little bit, but it definitely is not as dramatic as the Arches paper. The higher quality 100% cotton paper really seemed to make a big difference for me. Of course, any of these textures look pretty cool. It just kind of depends on the kind of look that you're going for. If you like the look to be a little bit more subtle, then that might work great for some of the paintings. It's really just up to you. And if you want to experiment with some of these elements, variations, or combinations a little bit more, you definitely can try out some of your own supplies and your own samples that you have at home. But I think the bottom line here is really that it's not about the salt type that makes the biggest difference. It's more about water control and the types of paper that you're choosing to use. And I didn't even get into different paint brands, but there's a chance that that could make a difference as well. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I hope it was helpful and answered some questions that you might have about salt texture. I think a lot of it really comes down to experimenting. Now that we know all the ins and outs of how to create an awesome salt texture, I think I'm going to do a painting next week that we can practice all the things that we learned with. So make sure you stay tuned for that. If you find you did enjoy this tutorial, I hope you'll consider subscribing to my channel so I can continue to help you discover your artistic side.